St. Mary Mead was not a place one associated with drama. It was a quaint village, full of rose-covered cottages, neatly trimmed hedges, and an air of quiet contentment. Life moved at a measured pace, and the most exciting events were the occasional garden parties or particularly heated discussion at the Women's Institute. That was, until the theft of the teacup. Of course, it was not just any teacup. It belonged to Mrs. Lavinia Hartnell, a formidable woman with a voice that could command a room and a nose for other people's business. The teacup in question was a delicate piece of china, part of a rare set handed down through her family for generations. It was blue and white with an intricate pattern, and Mrs. Hartnell delighted in recounting how it had once belonged to some distant relation of Queen Victoria herself. The theft, therefore, was no small matter in her eyes. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual chair by the window of her thatched cottage, had heard of the theft from her dear friend, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who had rushed over that very morning with the news: gone, simply vanished, and from her very own china cabinet. Mrs. Bantry declared dramatically, throwing her hands up, "Lavinia is in a state, as you can imagine. She insists someone has stolen it, and do you know what's worse? She suspects Mary." Mary Finch was Mrs. Hartnell's maid, a timid girl with wide brown eyes and a nervous disposition. She had been in service for nearly 5 years and had never been known to so much as misplace a spoon. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully, her blue eyes twinkling with interest. "And what makes Mrs. Hartnell suspect Mary?" "She says Mary was dusting in the sitting room the evening before last and was the last one near the cabinet. But really, Jane, Mary would never." Mrs. Bantry shook her head. "Colonel Bantry says it's all nonsense, but Lavinia is determined that it must have been her. The girl is beside herself." Miss Marple set her teacup down. "A most curious thing," she murmured. "And has there been any other excitement in the village recently?" Mrs. Bantry paused. "Well, there was that rather odd business with Mr. Harold Endicott." Harold Endicott was a recent arrival to the village, having moved into the ivy-covered house at the end of the lane. A retired professor, he was said to be rather eccentric. Apparently, he had some sort of disagreement with Mrs. Hartnell. "Last week," Mrs. Bantry went on, "something about his dog digging up her prized flower beds. He accused him of deliberately letting it happen, and he was quite offended. They had a rather public row outside the post office. Could he have taken the teacup out of spite?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People do act strangely when they feel slighted, but I should think stealing a teacup would be an unusual form of revenge." Just then, there was a sharp knock on the door, and before Miss Marple could call out, the door swung open to reveal Mrs. Hartnell herself, looking flustered and red-faced. "Jane, I simply must talk to you. You would not believe what has happened." Miss Marple gestured to the chair opposite her. "Do sit down, Lavinia. I believe you are speaking of your missing teacup." Mrs. Hartnell sank into the chair and fanned herself. "Yes, and it's not just missing, it's been stolen. It's taken right out of my cabinet, and the police are proving to be utterly useless." She gave a sharp sniff. "I told them it was Mary, but the inspector refused to arrest her on the spot. He said there was no evidence." "As if I'd accuse someone wrongly." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "You were quite certain that it was stolen, and not merely misplaced?" Mrs. Hartnell bristled. "Of course, I'm certain. I checked the cabinet myself. The rest of the set is there, but that one cup is gone." Miss Marple folded her hands. "A most interesting mystery, indeed. Perhaps I might look into the matter, if you would not mind." Mrs. Hartnell sniffed again, but nodded. "If anyone can make sense of this, Jane, it's you." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Then I shall begin at once." Miss Marple set out the next morning, a slight breeze ruffling the lace curtains in her cottage as she fastened her sensible hat. The theft of Mrs. Hartnell's teacup was an odd business, and if there was one thing Miss Marple knew, it was that even the smallest of mysteries had a way of leading to unexpected revelations. Her first visit was to Mary Finch, the accused maid. The poor girl had been in tears when Mrs. Bantry last spoke to her, and Miss Marple thought it best to start by hearing her side of the story. She walked briskly through the village, nodding to the greengrocer's wife and pausing briefly as Mr. Phelps, the butcher, tipped his hat in greeting. The Finch residence was a modest cottage at the end of a narrow lane, the small, well-kept garden. Miss Marple rapped gently on the door, and after a moment, Mary herself answered. Her eyes were red from crying, and she looked at Miss Marple in surprise. "Oh, Miss Marple," she exclaimed, wiping her hands on her apron. I wasn't expecting anyone." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you, my dear. I simply wanted to have a little chat." Mary hesitated, but then stepped aside. "Please, do come in." The sitting room was neat, though rather plain, with a small table by the window and a few modest chairs. Miss Marple sat down, folding her hands in her lap. "My dear," she began gently, "Mrs. Hartnell has made a rather unfortunate accusation against you. I wanted to hear from you directly. What do you think happened to the teacup?" Mary's hands twisted in her lap. "I don't know, Miss Marple. I swear I never touched it. I was dusting in the sitting room, like always, but I never opened the cabinet. I wouldn't dare." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And did you notice anything unusual that evening?" Mary bit her lip, thinking, "Well, now that you mention it, I did see something strange. Just as I was finishing up, I heard the back door close. I thought it was Mrs. Hartnell, but when I turned around, there was no one there. It was odd, because I know I locked the door earlier. I even checked it twice." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Did you mention this to Mrs. Hartnell?" Mary shook her head quickly. "No, I didn't want to upset her. She was already so cross about her missing teacup." Miss Marple nodded. "Quite understandable. Tell me, my dear, have you noticed anything else missing from the house?" Mary hesitated. "Not that I can think of, but there was something else. Yesterday morning, before Mrs. Hartnell discovered the teacup was gone, I found the front door slightly open when I arrived for work. I thought maybe she had forgotten to close it properly the night before, but now I wonder." Miss Marple patted Mary's hand reassuringly. "You have been most helpful, my dear. Now, don't you worry. We shall look into this matter further." Leaving Mary's cottage, Miss Marple considered what she had learned. A back door mysteriously unlocked. A front door found ajar. These were not the actions of a simple household accident. Someone had been in Mrs. Hartnell's house without her knowledge. And whether they had taken only the teacup or something else as well remained to be seen. She decided her next visit should be to Harold Endicott, the retired professor. If there had been a quarrel between him and Mrs. Hartnell, he might have had reason to act out of pettiness. Though, as Miss Marple reflected, stealing a single teacup seemed a rather peculiar form of revenge. Mr. Endicott's cottage was covered in ivy, giving it a rather wild and untamed appearance. Miss Marple knocked, and after a short wait, the door creaked open to reveal a man in his 60s, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes peering at her from behind round spectacles. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice full of curiosity. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, just a little matter that has been troubling me. May I come in for a moment?" He stepped aside, and she entered a room cluttered with books, stacks of papers, and an overwhelming smell of pipe tobacco. "Now, Mr. Endicott," Miss Marple began as she settled onto a chair, "I understand there was a bit of a disagreement between you and Mrs. Hartnell last week." Endicott snorted. "If you mean that ridiculous business with my dog, then yes. But let me assure you, Miss Marple, I had no reason to take anything from that woman's house. What on earth would I do with a stolen teacup?" "Quite so, Miss Marple. Agreed. And I suppose you were at home the evening before last. Sighed. I was. Spent most of the night reading boring. I know. But if you want proof, old Mrs. Pettigrew saw me through the window when she was walking her cat. You can ask her yourself. Miss Marple smiled. That does seem rather convincing. As she left Endicott's cottage, she was no closer to solving the mystery of the missing teacup. Yet something about Mary's account of the unlocked doors troubled her. It suggested that this was no simple case of theft by an opportunistic servant or disgruntled neighbor. No, there was something more to this, a thread that, if pulled, might unravel secrets hidden beneath the village's calm exterior. Miss Marple made her way toward the churchyard, where the Reverend Leonard Clement was tending to the flower beds. If anyone knew the village's secrets, it was the Reverend. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he called, dusting his hands off. "You're looking particularly thoughtful today." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Ah, well, there is a small matter that has piqued my interest." "Tell me, Reverend, have you noticed any unusual behavior in the village recently?" Reverend Clement raised an eyebrow. "Now that you mention it, there was something rather odd. Just last evening, I saw a shadow moving by the hedge outside the vicarage. It was late past 11. I assumed it was a lost traveler, but they disappeared before I could call out." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the handle of her handbag. "Curious indeed. Did you happen to see which direction they went?" "Toward the road leading to Mrs. Hartnell's house," he said thoughtfully. "But surely, Miss Marple, you don't think there's something amiss?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, my dear Reverend, I never assume anything, but I do believe this business is far from over." And with that, she continued down the lane, the wheels of her sharp mind turning. The missing teacup was merely the beginning. This thing was stirring beneath the surface of St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple intended to uncover exactly what it was. Miss Marple's walk back to the heart of St. Mary Mead was accompanied by the crisp morning air, the scent of damp earth, and the gentle murmur of village life. Mystery weather, grand or small, always had a way of unsettling the natural rhythm of things, and she sensed that this peculiar business with Mrs. Hartnell's missing teacup was no exception. At first glance, it seemed an inconsequential matter. Who would bother to steal an old piece of porcelain? And yet, the details unsettled Miss Marple in a way she could not ignore. The unlocked door, the strange figure seen in the vicarage garden. Mary Finch's distress, small thread, suggested a larger, more intricate pattern, and Miss Marple had spent a lifetime untangling such patterns. She decided that her next stop should be Mrs. Pettigrew's, the elderly widow, known for a tireless devotion to her cat, Solomon. Has been mentioned by Mr. Endicott as a witness to his whereabouts. Mrs. Pettigrew had a habit of observing the village from her sitting room window, and while her accounts were often embroidered with exaggeration, they nevertheless contained a kernel of truth. Mrs. Pettigrew lived in a small stone cottage just beyond the post office. Miss Marple knocked on the door, and after a moment, a voice called out, "One moment." A series of scuffling noises followed, as though a chair had been hastily pushed back, and finally, the door opened. Miss Marple, Mrs. Pettigrew, beamed, adjusting her lace shawl. "Come in, dear. I was just having my morning tea." Miss Marple entered the cozy sitting room, which was overflowing with crocheted cushions, porcelain figurines, and, of course, Solomon, who lounged on the windowsill like a king, surveying his domain. "I do hope I'm not interrupting," Miss Marple said, settling into an armchair. "Not at all, dear," Mrs. Pettigrew assured her. "It's always a pleasure to have company." Miss Marple smiled. "I was wondering if you happened to see anything unusual the other evening. I understand you saw Mr. Endicott through his window, reading." Mrs. Pettigrew nodded. "Oh, yes, plain as day. He was in his armchair, pipe in hand, looking terribly engrossed in some book or other. I remember because Solomon was watching him, and you know how cats are, they don't stare unless something interests them." Miss Marple's gaze flickered toward the cat, which blinked at her lazily. And was there anything else you noticed that evening? Anyone out and about at an unusual hour? Mrs. Pettigrew pursed her lips and thought. Now that you mention it, there was something odd. Just before I turned in for the night, I thought I saw someone walking down the lane toward Mrs. Hartnell's house. It was quite dark, and I didn't get a proper look, but whoever it was seemed to be in a hurry. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. A man or a woman? Mrs. Pettigrew hesitated. Hard to say. Connie. They were bundled up, coat, hat, the works, but they weren't walking leisurely. No. It was as if they didn't want to be seen. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. That is very interesting indeed. As she left Mrs. Pettigrew's cottage, Miss Marple reflected on this new piece of information. It was clear now that someone had been near Mrs. Hartnell's home at the time of the disappearance. The question remained, who and why? She made her way to the village shop, where she knew she would find Mrs. Bantry, who had promised to meet her there for a chat. As expected, the lively woman was already engaged in conversation with Mrs. Weatherby, the shopkeeper, over the quality of the latest delivery of tinned peaches. "Oh, Jane," Mrs. Bantry called as soon as she spotted Miss Marple. "You must tell me, have you uncovered anything fascinating yet?" Miss Marple chuckled. "Nothing conclusive, but I do believe this mystery is more tangled than it first appeared." Mrs. Weatherby leaned over the counter, her eyes gleaming with interest. "If you ask me, it's young Mary Finch you ought to be looking at. These young maids are always after something or other. Wouldn't it surprise me if she took that teacup to sell it?" Miss Marple shook her head. "I rather think not. She is terrified, not guilty." Mrs. Bantry sighed dramatically. "Well, it's all quite thrilling, isn't it? Stolen teacup, how delightfully absurd. Though, I must admit, I do wonder if it's connected to that stranger I saw in the village a few days ago." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "A stranger?" Mrs. Bantry nodded. "Yes, a rather peculiar man. I saw him just outside the post office, speaking with someone, though I couldn't see who. He had a rather nervous air about him, glancing about as though he were afraid of being watched." Miss Marple's mind whirred. A mysterious visitor, a missing teacup, an unlocked door. Were they all pieces of the same puzzle? "Did you catch anything else about him?" she asked. Mrs. Bantry tapped her chin. "Well, now that I think of it, he had a small leather case with him. Looked like the sort a traveling salesman might carry." Miss Marple tucked this new piece of information away. "Thank you, dear. You have been most helpful." As she stepped out of the shop, Miss Marple knew she had gathered enough pieces of the puzzle to form a clearer picture. The missing teacup was important, not because of its value, but because of what it represented. The question was, what was the thief really after? And more importantly, was this mystery truly as harmless as it seemed? Miss Marple had the distinct feeling that the answer to that question was about to reveal itself in a most unexpected way. The next morning, Miss Marple took her usual seat by the sitting-room window with a fresh pot of tea, gazing thoughtfully out over her neatly kept garden. The pieces of the mystery were beginning to take shape, though they had yet to settle into a clear picture. The stolen teacup had been dismissed by some as a petty theft, a mere inconvenience. But Miss Marple knew better. The curious details surrounding it, Mary Finch's distress, the unlocked door, Mrs. Pettigrew's sighting of a hurried figure in the lane, and now Mrs. Bantry's account of the mysterious stranger suggested something more complex. And complexity in a small village, Miss Marple had learned, often led to something rather unpleasant. She was still considering the matter when a firm knock rapped at her door. Rising, she opened it to find Detective Inspector Craddock standing there, his face set in a grim expression. "Ah, Miss Marple. I was hoping I might have a word," he said, stepping inside as she ushered him to a chair. "You look troubled, Inspector," she remarked, pouring him a cup of tea without needing to ask if he wanted one. Craddock sighed, running a hand over his neatly combed hair. "I suppose I am. This business with Mrs. Hartnell's missing teacup may not be as simple as we thought." Miss Marple's fingers barely hesitated over the teapot, though her mind sharpened. Oh, has something happened? The inspector set down his hat and met her gaze. "Mrs. Hartnell has been found dead." Miss Marple placed the teapot down with careful precision. "My dear Inspector," she said, her voice steady but laced with genuine concern. "That is most shocking." Craddock nodded grimly. "It appears to have been an accident. The doctor believes she fell down the stairs in her home late last night, broke her neck. No sign of forced entry, no struggle. At first glance, it seems quite straightforward." Miss Marple pursed her lips. "And yet, you are here." The inspector gave a small, humorless smile. "Indeed, you know me too well, Miss Marple. Something about this doesn't sit right." He leaned forward. Mrs. Hartnell was no frail woman. She was sprightly for her age, and those stairs, well, they aren't particularly treacherous. But more than that, there's something off about the scene. No sign she tripped over anything. No misplaced rug, no fallen object that might have caught her foot. Miss Marple nodded, understanding at once. "You suspect she did not fall by accident?" Craddock hesitated before exhaling sharply. "I can't prove otherwise just yet, but my instincts tell me this is all tied together. First, a peculiar theft, then an unexplained death. Seems too much of a coincidence." Miss Marple sat back, considering. When was she last seen? "The housekeeper, Mrs. Webb, left around 5:30 yesterday evening. She said Mrs. Hartnell was in fine spirits, planning to write letters before retiring early. The milkman discovered her body this morning when he saw the front door slightly ajar. The door was open." Craddock nodded. "A crack, just enough to raise suspicion. Yet nothing appears stolen aside from that confounded teacup." Miss Marple set down her cup, her mind clicking rapidly through the possibilities. "Inspector, if I may offer an observation, perhaps the teacup was not stolen for its own sake, but for something hidden within it." Craddock frowned. "You think it contained something valuable, or more likely, something incriminating," she mused. "We must ask ourselves why someone would risk breaking into Mrs. Hartnell's home for something so seemingly trivial." Craddock exhaled. "I was hoping you might take an interest in this, Miss Marple. The village, as you well know, has its fair share of gossip, but underneath it all, you always seem to see what others miss." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I should be very glad to help in any way I can, Inspector." Miss Marple wasted no time. After the inspector's departure, she took a stroll through the village, noting the hushed whispers outside the greengrocer's and the stolen glances exchanged at the post office. Mrs. Hartnell's sudden death had sent ripples of unease through St. Mary Mead. She paused outside the vicarage gate, her eyes narrowing as she caught sight of a familiar figure lingering just out of view. Mary Finch. The young maid stood near the old oak tree, clutching her shawl around her shoulders, her gaze darting nervously in every direction. With deliberate calm, Miss Marple approached. "Mary, dear, how are you?" The girl startled, turning wide eyes toward Miss Marple. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you there." Miss Marple studied her closely. "You look troubled, child. Has something upset you?" Mary bit her lip before whispering, "It's about Mrs. Hartnell. Didn't mean to pry, but I saw something." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Tell me, dear, what did you see?" Mary hesitated, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "Last night, I was walking back from the vicarage after supper, and I passed by Mrs. Hartnell's house. I didn't mean to stop truly, but I heard something, a noise, like a crash." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "And then?" Mary swallowed. I saw a figure, a man, I think. He was slipping out of the back door." It was dark, and I couldn't see his face, and he moved quickly, too quickly for someone who had any right being there at that hour. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Did you see anything else? Anything at all that might help? Mary hesitated before nodding. Yes, he had a case with him, a small black case, like the kind doctors carry. A thrill of realization coursed through Miss Marple. A black case. It's just like the one Mrs. Bantry had seen with the mysterious stranger. Mary gripped her shawl tightly. Miss Marple, I think he saw me. Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on the girl's arm. You were very brave to tell me this, Mary, but you must be careful now. Mary's lower lip trembled. Do you think he killed her? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the vicarage, toward the peaceful cottages of St. Mary Mead, all so seemingly undisturbed. And yet, beneath the tranquil surface, danger lurked. Finally, she said, I think, my dear, that we are very close to the truth. And, she thought, silently, someone in this village would do anything to keep that truth buried. The village of St. Mary Mead was not accustomed to such grim disturbances. A stolen teacup was one thing, a murder was quite another. By the next morning, the news of Mrs. Hartnell's death had woven its way through every cottage, shop, and parlor, carried in hushed voices over garden fences and behind lace curtains. Miss Marple sat in her favorite chair, knitting needles clicking softly as she considered the pieces of the puzzle now laid before her. The death of Mrs. Hartnell, seemingly accidental, was anything but. Mary Finch's frightened account of a shadowy figure leaving the scene, carrying a black case, was a detail too distinct to be ignored. Then there was the matter of the stolen teacup, seemed, in its own strange way, to be at the heart of everything. A sharp rap at the door broke through her thoughts. Setting her knitting aside, she rose and opened it to find Mrs. Bantry standing there, looking quite flustered. Oh, Jane, dear, she said, stepping in without preamble. I had to come at once. It's all simply too much. The whole village is in an absolute state, what with Mrs. Hartnell gone, and now this business with Dr. Latimer. Miss Marple frowned slightly. Dr. Latimer. Mrs. Bantry perched on the edge of a chair, twisting her gloves anxiously. Yes, you know how he sometimes calls on elderly patients in the morning. Apparently, he was seen going into Mrs. Hartnell's house yesterday evening. Not officially, mind you, there's no record of it, but Mrs. Webb, the housekeeper, swears she heard voices in the drawing room after she left. She thought nothing of it at the time, assumed it was just a friend calling. But then, this morning, Dr. Latimer failed to open his surgery at the usual hour. Miss Marple's brow lifted slightly. Oh dear, has something happened to him? That's just it, Mrs. Bantry whispered dramatically. No one can find him. He's disappeared. Miss Marple, despite the seriousness of the matter, felt a quiet sense of confirmation settle in her mind. How very interesting. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. Jane, what do you think it means? Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, looking out over the village square. I think, she said thoughtfully, that Dr. Latimer knew something. And I think someone was very determined to ensure he did not share it. Inspector Craddock arrived at the Hartnell residence later that morning, his expression grim. The investigation had taken an unsettling turn, and he did not like it one bit. The apparent accident now seemed far from accidental, and the sudden disappearance of Dr. Latimer only added to the growing sense of unease. Miss Marple, having anticipated his arrival, was already waiting near the gate, her gloved hands folded neatly before her. Inspector, she greeted him pleasantly. Craddock sighed. I suppose you've heard the latest. Indeed, Mrs. Bantry was most informative. The inspector gave a weary nod. The whole business is getting worse by the minute. First, a stolen teacup. Again, Mrs. Hartnell's accident. And now, Latimer vanishes into thin air. He exhaled sharply. Something is very wrong here, Miss Marple. She nodded. Yes, indeed, and I believe we are nearing a rather important discovery. Craddock studied her keenly. Do you have something in mind? She smiled, her eyes twinkling. Only a theory, Inspector, but one that requires a bit more testing. Miss Marple's next stop was Mary Finch's small lodgings behind the vicarage. Carol had been frightened the day before, and Miss Marple had no doubt that fear had only grown overnight. She knocked gently, and a moment later, Mary's pale face appeared at the door. Oh, Miss Marple, she gasped. I was just about to come find you. Miss Marple's gaze softened. My dear, what's happened? Mary's hands trembled as she pulled the door wider. Come in, please. Miss Marple stepped inside and saw at once that Mary had not slept well. The girl's eyes were shadowed, and her hands kept twisting in the fabric of her apron. Tell me everything, dear, Miss Marple encouraged. Mary took a deep breath. Last night, after we spoke, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what I'd seen, about that man with the black case. And then I heard something outside my window. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around her handbag. Go on, Mary shivered. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I saw a shadow move past the garden gate. And then this morning, when I went to open the back door, I found this. She reached over to the table and picked up a small, folded piece of paper. Hands trembling, she passed it to Miss Marple. Miss Marple opened it carefully and read the hastily scrawled words. Forget what you saw, or you'll be next. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Miss Marple folded the note neatly and placed it in her handbag. Well, that simply won't do, she said firmly. Mary blinked at her. Miss Marple, the elderly woman, smiled reassuringly. You mustn't worry, dear. You've done the right thing in telling me, and I promise you we shall get to the bottom of this. But as she left Mary's lodgings, Miss Marple felt a deepening sense of urgency. Someone in St. Mary Mead was growing desperate, and desperation, she knew, was when murderers made their final fatal mistakes. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat quietly for a long while, piecing together the events. The stolen teacup, Mrs. Hartnell's death, Dr. Latimer's disappearance. And now, this chilling warning to Mary Finch. She thought of Mrs. Bantry's mention of a black case, the way Dr. Latimer had been seen entering Mrs. Hartnell's house. If he had been there the night of her death, had he seen something? Or worse, had he taken something? Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A doctor's case, a stolen teacup, and a secret someone was willing to kill for. She stood, smoothing her skirts. It was time to have a little chat with Inspector Craddock. For, she was right, the answer to the mystery was closer than anyone realized. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead, weaving through the trees and hedgerows like a ghostly veil. Miss Marple stepped out of her cottage, buttoning her cardigan against the lingering chill. The village was unusually subdued. Mrs. Hartnell's death had cast a long shadow, and now, with Dr. Latimer's disappearance, an air of unease settled over the residence like an ill-fitting cloak. Miss Marple made her way toward the police station, where she knew Inspector Craddock would be busy, piecing together the tangled web of events. As she approached the building, she spotted him standing outside, speaking in low tones with Constable Graves. The constable's expression was troubled, and as she drew near, caught the last fragment of their conversation. No sign of him anywhere, sir, Graves was saying. Not at his home, not at the surgery. His car still parked behind the practice, untouched. Craddock exhaled sharply. It's as if he vanished into thin air. Miss Marple cleared her throat gently. Inspector, might I have a word? Craddock turned, his brows lifting slightly in recognition. Miss Marple, good morning, though I fear there's little good about it. Quite, she agreed. I hear Dr. Latimer is still missing. Craddock nodded grimly. We've checked all the usual places. His housekeeper says he never came home last night. The last confirmed sighting was around 7 in the evening when he left the Hartnell residence. After that, nothing. Miss Marple tapped a thoughtful finger against her handbag. Tell me, Inspector, was Dr. Latimer known to be carrying his medical case when he visited Mrs. Hartnell? Craddock frowned. According to Mrs. Webb, the housekeeper, yes, he always had it with him. Okay. And yet, Miss Marple mused, when he left, there was a sighting of a man carrying a black case. An unusual detail, wouldn't you say? Craddock crossed his arms. Taya, you'd think it wasn't his own case he left with. Miss Marple smiled ever so slightly. I think it is quite possible that Dr. Latimer saw or learned something while he was visiting Mrs. Hartnell, something important enough that he felt compelled to take it with him. Craddock straightened. You mean he might have taken something from her house? Miss Marple inclined her head. And whatever it was, someone wanted it back badly enough to make him disappear. The inspector's gaze sharpened. We need to search his home again. If he did take something, he might have hidden it before he was. He hesitated, removed from the scene. Miss Marple finished gently. Yes, I quite agree. Dr. Latimer's house stood at the end of a quiet lane, its ivy-clad walls and neatly trimmed hedges giving no indication of the turmoil surrounding its owner. Constable Graves had already searched the property once, but under Inspector Craddock's orders. A more thorough examination was now underway. Miss Marple followed the inspector inside, her sharp eyes scanning the room as they entered the doctor's study. Books lined the shelves in orderly rows, medical journals stacked neatly on the desk. A glass-fronted cabinet housed an assortment of medicines and vials, meticulously labeled. Nothing appeared disturbed. Craddock sighed. If he did hide something, it's well concealed. Miss Marple moved slowly through the room, taking in the small details. Scuff on the floorboards near the desk, a chair slightly askew. Her gaze settled on the fireplace. Above it, a large antique clock ticked solemnly. Inspector, she murmured, stepping closer, would you be so kind as to check behind this clock? Craddock frowned, but did as she asked, lifting the clock carefully. Behind it, tucked neatly into the wooden crevice, was a folded piece of paper. Craddock unfolded it and read aloud. I know the truth. Meet me at the old mill, 11 o'clock. Come alone. A chill settled over the room. Craddock looked at Miss Marple. This must be what got him taken. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, it seems Dr. Latimer had uncovered something after all. The old mill stood on the outskirts of the village, a crumbling relic of another time. Its weathered stone walls and broken wheel gave it an eerie, abandoned feel. Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock arrived just as the church bell struck 11. Craddock gestured for Constable Graves to circle around the back while he and Miss Marple approached the front entrance. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing the dimly lit interior. Dust motes swirled in the faint sunlight filtering through the cracks in the roof. Then, sound faint, muffled, Craddock held up a hand for silence, then moved cautiously forward. In the farthest corner, beneath a pile of old sacks, was a figure, Dr. Latimer. His wrists were bound, his face pale, but he was alive. Craddock rushed forward, untying the ropes. Doctor, are you hurt? Latimer groaned, rubbing his wrists. No, just shaken. Thank God you found me. Miss Marple crouched beside him. Who did this to you? Latimer swallowed. Kai, I don't know. I never saw their face. Apati were waiting for me when I arrived at the mill. Said I had something that didn't belong to me. Craddock pressed. What did you take from Mrs. Hartnell's house? Latimer hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, delicate object. A teacup. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Ah, the stolen teacup. Craddock looked. Between them, you mean to tell me this whole thing has been about a teacup? Latimer shook his head. Not the cup itself. What was inside it? He tipped it slightly. Something small and folded fell into Miss Marple's palm. A piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully. The ink was faded but legible, and as she read the words, she understood. Miss Marple looked up at Craddock. "Inspector, I do believe we have found the motive for murder." Craddock took the paper and scanned it, his eyes widening. "Well," he muttered, "that certainly changes things." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and it tells us exactly who our murderer is." As they left the old mill, Miss Marple's mind was already arranging the final pieces of the puzzle. Mrs. Hartnell's death had not been random. The stolen teacup had not been a meaningless act of mischief. Someone had killed to ensure that. Secret remained hidden, but secrets, as Miss Marple well knew, had a way of coming to light, and soon the murderer would have nowhere left to hide. A heavy rain had begun to fall over St. Mary Mead by the time Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock returned to the village. The discovery at the old mill had left them both with more questions than answers. Dr. Latimer had been attacked, tied up, and left for dead, but he was alive. The same could not be said for Mrs. Hartnell, and now Dade found the missing teacup and the mysterious note hidden within it. Craddock drove straight to the police station, while Miss Marple returned to her cozy cottage. She was not a woman to jump to conclusions, nor one to act in haste. She had learned over many years that the best way to untangle a mystery was to sit with it, to let it simmer, much like a well-brewed pot of tea. As she settled into her armchair, she unfolded the small piece of paper retrieved from the teacup. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. "If anything happens to me, it is because of what I know. The truth is in the will. Seek out the name not written." Miss Marple pursed her lips. Mrs. Hartnell had clearly suspected danger, but why? Had she hidden this note in something as inconspicuous as a teacup? A clever hiding place, certainly, but for what purpose? She tapped a finger against her lips. Seek out the name not written. A will. An omission. It was time to find out exactly what Mrs. Hartnell had left behind. The following morning, Miss Marple made her way to the home of Mr. Alfred Henderson, the village solicitor. A man of advancing years and fastidious habits, Mr. Henderson had served St. Mary Mead's legal needs for decades. His office, tucked neatly behind the post office, smelled of ink, old books, and the faintest trace of pipe tobacco. Henderson looked up as she entered. "Miss Marple, what an unexpected pleasure." She gave him a kind smile. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson. I hope I am not disturbing you." "Not at all, my dear lady. Do sit down." He gestured toward a well-worn leather chair opposite his desk. Miss Marple wasted no time. "I believe you were responsible for drafting Mrs. Hartnell's will." Henderson adjusted his spectacles. "Indeed, I was. A most straightforward document, I assure you. Was there anything unusual about it?" Henderson frowned. "Unusual? No, I wouldn't say so. She left most of her estate to her niece, Catherine Hartnell, and a few smaller bequests to others. Nothing remarkable." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Henderson, may I trouble you to let me see a copy?" He hesitated for only a moment before opening a drawer and retrieving a folder. He laid it before her and flipped to the appropriate page. Miss Marple scanned the document quickly. Catherine Hartnell, as expected, was the primary beneficiary. Several villagers were mentioned a small sum to Mrs. Webb, as a housekeeper, a modest donation to the local church. She read through the names carefully. Then she read them again. And then she saw it. Or, rather, she saw what wasn't there. Miss Marple's breath caught. The answer had been staring them in the face all along. By the time Miss Marple arrived at the police station, she found Inspector Craddock deep in conversation with Dr. Latimer. The doctor, still visibly shaken from his ordeal, was nursing a cup of tea. He looked up as Miss Marple entered. Miss Marple, Craddock greeted her. I was just about to come looking for you. And I, Miss Marple replied, have come to tell you exactly who killed Mrs. Hartnell. Craddock straightened, you know. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Inspector. The answer was in the will all along. Latimer frowned. But I read the will. There was nothing unusual about it. Miss Marple gave him a gentle smile. But that is precisely where you and the rest of us have made our mistake. We have all been looking at what is written, when, in fact, the true clue lay in what was not written. Craddock leaned forward, explained. Miss Marple placed her handbag on her lap and folded her hands. When reading a will, one naturally expects to find the names of close family members and dependents. Mrs. Hartnell, a woman of considerable means, left her estate primarily to her niece, Catherine. A few minor sums were distributed among servants and acquaintances. And yet, Inspector, there is one person conspicuously absent from the document. She paused, letting the moment settle. Her son, Dr. Latimer, choked on his tea. Craddock stared. Her son. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, you may recall that Mrs. Hartnell's son, Richard, was believed to have died years ago under tragic circumstances. He was presumed lost at sea, and yet, she reached into her handbag and withdrew the note from the teacup, laying it on the table. Mrs. Hartnell clearly suspected something. Seek out the name not written. She must have discovered that her son was, in fact, alive. Craddock absorbed this in silence. Miss Marple continued. Someone didn't want her to alter her will. If she had, it would have changed everything. Richard would have reclaimed his inheritance, displacing those who had been expecting to benefit. Craddock's face darkened. Catherine. Miss Marple nodded solemnly. Catherine Hartnell had the most to lose. If Mrs. Hartnell had changed her will, Catherine's inheritance would have vanished. That, I fear, was motive enough for murder. Doctor. Latimer exhaled. But what about my attack? Miss Marple regarded him kindly. I believe Catherine learned that you had found something in her aunt's home. Perhaps she even saw you take the teacup. She feared that you had discovered the note, so she arranged to have you silenced before you could read it. Craddock stood abruptly. We need to bring her in. Okay. Miss Marple placed a hand on his arm. Patience, Inspector. There is one more piece to this puzzle. We must be certain. Craddock narrowed his eyes. What do you suggest? Miss Marple's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. I suggest we set a trap. That evening, Catherine Hartnell was invited to the vicarage under the pretense of a social gathering. The village, still buzzing with gossip, thought nothing of it as the guests mingled. Miss Marple and Craddock watched Catherine closely. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, smiling, laughing, but Miss Marple saw the tension in her eyes, the stiffness in her shoulders. She was waiting, watching. When the moment was right, Miss Marple approached her. My dear, such tragic times for you. And yet, a remarkable thing has happened. Catherine arched a brow. Oh, Miss Marple nodded. Yes, it seems Richard is alive after all. Catherine's breath hitched, and then she made a fatal mistake. She laughed, but it was too forced, too quick. Her eyes darted toward the door. Inspector. Craddock stepped forward. Miss Hartnell, I'm afraid we have a few more questions for you. The color drained from Catherine's face, and Miss Marple knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that they had their murderer. The air inside the vicarage was thick with anticipation. Miss Marple had seen it before that moment when a carefully laid trap begins to close around its prey. Catherine Hartnell's laughter had been her undoing, a slip so slight that only an expert observer would have caught it. And now, the next move had to be executed with precision. Inspector Craddock stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Miss Hartnell, if you would kindly accompany me to the station, I have a few questions I'd like to ask. Catherine's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. Inspector, Surely you don't think? She let out a light chuckle, shaking her head. This is all a terrible misunderstanding. My aunt's death was tragic, but I hardly see why I'm being questioned. Miss Marple, seated comfortably in the corner, spoke gently. My dear, the truth has a way of revealing itself in time, and in my experience, when people are guilty of something, they often show it in the most unexpected ways. Catherine turned sharply to her blue eyes narrowing. Are you accusing me, Miss Marple? Oh, not at all, Miss Marple replied, knitting calmly. I am simply saying that actions speak volumes. You see, when I mentioned Richard being alive, you reacted rather prematurely, wouldn't you say? Catherine's lips parted slightly, and for a fraction of a second, there was a flash of something in her expression: fear, anger, or perhaps both. Then she schooled her face into a look of cool indifference. Richard is dead. Inspector Craddock crossed his arms. You seem very sure of that, Miss Hartnell. But what if I told you we had reason to believe he wasn't? Catherine let out a short, incredulous laugh. Then I'd say you were mistaken. Miss Marple set down her knitting and clasped her hands in her lap. And yet, your aunt's note suggested otherwise. Seek out the name not written. She tilted her head. Your aunt knew something that put her life in danger. Catherine folded her arms. Then you'd think I had something to do with that? Miss Marple sighed, her blue eyes twinkling with something resembling pity. It does seem rather coincidental, does it not? You were set to inherit everything. But if your mother had changed her will if Richard was alive, well, that would have changed things dramatically. The room fell silent. Catherine's face was an unreadable mask, but the tension in her posture was unmistakable. Then, after a long pause, she exhaled sharply. Fine, if you insist on dragging me through this ridiculous charade. Let's go to the station. Craddock exchanged a look with Miss Marple, then gestured toward the door. After you. The interrogation room at the police station was stark and unwelcoming. Catherine sat opposite Inspector Craddock, her posture still impeccable though. Her hands were clenched tightly in her lap. Miss Marple observed from the corner a quiet presence in the unfolding drama. Craddock leaned forward. Let's start from the beginning, Miss Hartnell. Where were you on the evening of your aunt's murder? Catherine sighed. At home, of course. I was reading in the drawing room. Craddock didn't look up from his notes. Alone. She hesitated. Yes. Miss Marple clicked her tongue softly. How very convenient. Catherine turned to her sharply. What is that supposed to mean? Miss Marple gave a small, apologetic smile. Nothing, dear. Only that it does seem to be a rather unfortunate coincidence that you have no one to corroborate your alibi. Catherine's lips pressed into a thin line. Are you suggesting that I sneaked into my aunt's house, poisoned her, and then vanished into the night unnoticed? That's absurd. Craddock tapped his pen against the table. Not so absurd, Miss Hartnell. You knew your way around the house. You could have slipped in through the back. There's also Dr. Latimer's attack to consider. He was left for dead at the old mill. Why? 'Cause he had something your aunt wanted hid in a teacup. Catherine's eyes flickered with something akin to panic, but she quickly regained her composure. Inspector, you have no proof of any of this. Craddock nodded. That's why we're still asking questions. Okay, now, tell me, Miss Hartnell, when was the last time you saw your aunt alive? Okay. She hesitated again, her fingers gripping the arm of the chair. A day before her death. Miss Marple watched carefully. She had seen this before, a person grasping for just the right answer, attempting to tread carefully. But Catherine was slipping. She could feel the walls closing in. Craddock leaned forward. And did she say anything unusual? Anything that struck you as odd? Catherine wet her lips. She mentioned she had something important to do, but she didn't say what. Miss Marple gave a small nod. because she had discovered the truth about Richard. Catherine looked away. This is ridiculous. You have no evidence. Miss Marple smiled. Not yet, my dear. The thing about secrets is that they have a way of coming to light. Craddock sighed. Miss Hartnell, until we can verify your statements, I'm afraid we must ask you to remain here. Catherine tensed. You're arresting me? Not yet, Craddock said. But we need answers. Miss Marple rose from her chair and adjusted her shawl. Good evening, Inspector. I believe I shall leave you to it. Craddock gave her a sharp look. You're leaving? Miss Marple gave a knowing smile. I think we shall have all the proof we need by morning. As she stepped outside, the cold night air bracing against her skin, she allowed herself the smallest of smiles. The trap was set, and soon the final piece of the puzzle would fall into place. The village of St. Mary Mead had settled into a tense quiet, the kind that often precedes a storm. The murder of Mr. Edwin Carmichael had rattled the delicate social structure of the village, but Miss Marple, in her quiet and unassuming way, was beginning to see the shape of the truth. Despite Inspector Morton's insistence that the case was progressing, Miss Marple knew better. The police were chasing shadows, focusing on tangible evidence while ignoring the human element, motives, relationships, and the tiny contradictions that, when pieced together, formed a perfect picture of guilt. Seated in her parlor, Miss Marple methodically went over everything she had observed. The stolen teacup remained a curious anomaly, not in its theft alone, but in the peculiar fact that it had reappeared in a completely different place. What was its significance? A trivial thing, surely, except that trivial things, in Miss Marple's experience, were often the most revealing. She was still contemplating when there was a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Weatherby, flustered and out of breath. Oh, Miss Marple, the most dreadful thing, she gasped, gripping the edge of the armchair as she sank into it. Oh dear, I hardly know how to say it. Miss Marple poured a calming cup of tea. Take your time, dear. It's about Letitia Blackwell. Mrs. Weatherby managed. Kai saw her just this morning, and she was in such a state. Kai, she said. Oh, Miss Marple, she said she knows who the murderer is. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. How very interesting. Mrs. Weatherby leaned in closer. She said she saw something that night, something she shouldn't have seen. She was terribly afraid, but she wouldn't tell me what it was. Said she needed to think first. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her teacup. A person who knew too much was always in danger. Did she say anything else? Not only that it had to do with the teacup, Mrs. Weatherby whispered. I told her to go straight to the police, but she was so frightened, Miss Marple. And now she hesitated, looking even more distressed. Now she's disappeared. A heavy silence followed. Miss Marple took a moment to gather her thoughts. If Letitia Blackwell had vanished, then one of two things had happened. Either she had fled out of fear, or someone had ensured she wouldn't speak. Miss Marple rose. I must see Inspector Morton at once. Inspector Morton was at the police station, his patience frayed as he listened to conflicting witness statements. When Miss Marple arrived, he sighed, though not unkindly. Miss Marple, I assume you have something new? I do indeed, Inspector, she said crisply. Letitia Blackwell has disappeared. The inspector's expression changed. Disappeared. She confided in Mrs. Weatherby that she had seen something on the night of Mr. Carmichael's murder. She claimed to know who the killer was and mentioned the stolen teacup as being important. But before she could go to the police, she vanished. Inspector Morton ran a hand through his hair. This is getting out of hand. First a murder, now a disappearance. If you're right, then someone is getting desperate. Miss Marple nodded gravely. Indeed, Inspector. The murderer, whoever they are, has realized that their secret is at risk. If Letitia Blackwell truly saw something, then she was silenced. Morton stood. We need to find her immediately. The village was alive with speculation as word of Letitia Blackwell's disappearance spread. Search parties were organized, combing through the quiet streets, the woods beyond the village, and even the churchyard where Carmichael had been found. Miss Marple, however, knew that the best way to find Letitia was not through a frantic search, but through logical deduction. She revisited the Carmichael house, taking her time to observe the small details others had overlooked. The tea set was still displayed on the sideboard, but now she noticed something peculiar. The teacups, aside from the one that had been stolen, were all part of a matching set. The stolen teacup, when it reappeared, had been a different design. Entirely, Miss Marple's eyes shone with understanding. Someone had stolen the original teacup, replaced it with a similar one, and in their haste had failed to match it exactly. But why? The answer came swiftly. Poison. A poisoned teacup would be a dangerous piece of evidence. The killer must have realized their mistake after the murder, returned to the house, and swapped the real teacup for a fake one to remove all traces of the poison. But who had drunk from that cup? The answer was obvious. Edwin Carmichael. And now, the person who had seen the truth Letitia Blackwell was missing at dusk. Miss Marple walked past the Blackwell cottage, peering through the window. The house was dark, but something wasn't right. The door was ajar. She knocked gently. No answer. With quiet determination, Miss Marple stepped inside. The house was eerily silent, but as she moved further in, she heard a soft sound, muffled cry. Following the noise, she reached a small cupboard under the stairs. She pulled the door open. There, bound and terrified, was Letitia Blackwell. "Oh, Miss Marple," she sobbed as the older woman untied her. I thought I was going to die." Miss Marple held her hands firmly. "You are safe now, dear. Tell me who did this to you." Tears streamed down Letitia's face as she whispered a name. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "I see." The final piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place. The sun was beginning its slow descent over St. Mary Mead as Inspector Morton gathered the villagers in the drawing room of the Carmichael estate. The air inside was thick with anticipation, whispers passing between the assembled guests like an unspoken storm. They all knew what was coming, reckoning. At the heart of it all, seated in her usual unassuming manner, was Miss Marple. Her delicate hands rested in her lap, but her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. Inspector Morton stood before them. "As you all know, we've had two disturbing events: the murder of Mr. Edwin Carmichael and the sudden disappearance of Miss Letitia Blackwell. Thanks to Miss Marple, was found bound and left for dead in her own home." A gasp rippled through the room. Letitia, sitting near Miss Marple, was pale but determined. Morton continued, "Miss Blackwell has informed us that she saw something on the night of Mr. Carmichael's death, something that frightened her enough to keep quiet until now." Silence fell. All eyes turned to Miss Marple. She smiled ever so slightly before speaking. "Murder, my dear friends, is often much like an improperly brewed cup of tea bitter. It's unpleasant, and with a few stray leaves that give away the truth." Several people exchanged confused glances. "The stolen teacup," Miss Marple continued, "has always been the key. At first, one might think its disappearance was a mere accident or prank. But no, this teacup held the very method of murder." A collective murmur spread through the room. "The truth, you see, lies in the simple act of substitution. A teacup that was returned was not the same one that was taken. The original was removed because it contained evident traces of poison, a sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the crowd." "Yes," Miss Marple said, eyes scanning the faces before her. "Mr. Carmichael did not die of natural causes, nor was he struck down in the dark by a sudden attacker. He was poisoned." "Poisoned?" Mrs. Weatherby exclaimed. "Indeed," Miss Marple continued. "The murder was planned with great care. A lethal dose of digitalis was placed in Mr. Carmichael's cup and is elite obtainable poison if one knows where to look. He drank it unsuspectingly, his death appearing sudden, almost natural. Inspector Morton nodded. And the murderer, realizing their mistake, later returned to the house, stole the poisoned cup, and replaced it with a near identical one. Miss Marple inclined her head. Correct, Inspector? Dear Letitia Blackwell saw the culprit that night, though. At the time, she did not understand what she had witnessed. All eyes turned to Letitia, who swallowed and nodded. I saw someone in the Carmichael house after the police had left, she stammered. I thought it was strange, but I didn't want to cause trouble. And then, when I heard about the teacup, I knew he knew they had gone back to remove something. Miss Marple turned her gaze towards the assembled suspects. But who, you might ask, had the opportunity and the means? A tense silence. Miss Marple's voice was calm but firm. The answer, dear friends, is someone who knew Mr. Carmichael well. Someone who had access to his home. Someone who knew of his fondness for evening tea. And someone who had a motive, whether personal or financial, to want him dead. She turned, finally settling her gaze on a single figure in the room. Miss Elizabeth Carmichael. A stunned silence. Elizabeth Carmichael, the dead man's niece, went utterly pale. Then she forced a laugh. Miss Marple, you must be mistaken. I was nowhere near Uncle Edwin's house that night. Miss Marple's smile was almost gentle. Oh, but you were, my dear. Letitia saw you, didn't she? All eyes turned to Letitia, who hesitated, then nodded. Us, she whispered. I saw you, Miss Carmichael. Elizabeth's fingers curled around the arms of her chair. That's nonsense, Miss Marple continued, as though she had not spoken. Mr. Carmichael had recently altered his will, had he not? I suspect the police will find that the new will, if it has not already been conveniently destroyed, was very much not in Miss Elizabeth's favor. Inspector Morton's face darkened. We'll confirm that soon enough. Miss Marple pressed on. Elizabeth, you were the one who brewed Mr. Carmichael's tea that evening. You slipped the poison into his cup, confident that no one would suspect you. After all, his heart was weak. Who would question his sudden collapse? But when you realized that the police were treating his death as suspicious, you panicked, returned, to steal the poisoned teacup and replace it with another. Unfortunately for you, Letitia Blackwell saw you. Elizabeth shot to her feet. This is ridiculous. You have no proof. Miss Marple sighed, looking almost pitying. Oh, but my dear, the proof is already with the police. They found traces of digitalis in your home, perhaps, an old prescription of your mother's. Elizabeth's face drained of color. Inspector Morton stepped forward. Miss Carmichael, I'm afraid you'll have to come with us. Nara was a beat of silence, then, with a sudden, wild cry, Elizabeth grabbed the nearest heavy objective brass candlestick and lunged, but she never made it far. Morton caught her wrist, twisting it away as two constables stepped in. She crumpled, sobbing, as the realization of her failure washed over her as she was led away. The room remained frozen in silence. Then, slowly, the tension eased. The villagers turned to Miss Marple with something like awe. Mrs. Weatherby was the first to speak. My dear Miss Marple, how do you always know? Miss Marple smiled serenely, lifting her teacup. Oh, my dear, one learns an awful lot from simply observing. People, they are, after all, very much like characters in a novel if one only pays attention to the details. The room filled with a mixture of laughter and admiration as the village settled back into its routine. The case of the stolen teacup and the murderer concealed became yet another tale of St. Mary Mead. One whispered over garden fences and discussed over afternoon tea, and at the heart of it all, Miss Marple, ever watchful, ever patient, simply carried on knitting, listening, and waiting for the next mystery to unfold.